The brass watch lay heavy in Archibald Whitmore's palm as he traced the intricate engravings with his slender finger. The timepiece had once belonged to his father, like everything else in this dusty workshop hidden beneath the floorboards of their modest country home. 17 years of life had taught Archibald patience, a virtue necessary for a boy who spent his days repairing pocket watches, while other lads his age worked the fields or courted village girls. But patience was also essential for someone trying to decode the secrets of a man who had vanished 5 years ago, leaving behind nothing but peculiar contraptions and fragmented journals. Rain tapped gently against the small window near the ceiling of his hidden sanctuary. Outside, the English countryside of 1873 was enveloped in one of those dense autumn fogs that seemed to swallow everything beyond one's immediate surroundings. Archibald preferred it this way. The isolation suited him, kept the curious eyes of Millfield's residents from prying too deeply into his affairs. They already whispered about the odd Whitmore boy who kept to himself and spoke in terms and concepts beyond his years. Just like his father, they'd say, though never within earshot. Brilliant, but touched in the head. Archibald adjusted the small brass magnifying glass attached to his workbench lamp and carefully placed the back panel of a pocket watch into position. His fingers, despite their youth, moved with the practiced precision of a master craftsman. He had inherited his father's mechanical intuition, along with his dark, unruly hair and penetrating grey eyes that now narrowed in concentration as he guided a tiny screwdriver with surgical precision. "There now," he muttered to himself, as the watch began ticking with a satisfying rhythm. "Back to life you go!" He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction, then placed the repaired watch on a velvet cushion beside 6 others, all commissions from townsfolk who begrudgingly admitted that, peculiar though he might be, young Whitmore had a gift for breathing life back into timepieces others had declared beyond salvation. It was this skill that kept a roof over his head and food on his table, since his mother had followed his father into whatever mysterious beyond had claimed them both. Archibald stretched his stiff shoulders and glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner, a magnificent piece his father had built from scratch, its pendulum swinging with hypnotic constancy. Nearly midnight. He should retire, but sleep rarely came easily to him, and tonight something else nagged at his consciousness, a feeling he couldn't quite identify, like the subtle off-rhythm tick of a watch with a hairspring just beginning to fail. His gaze drifted to the far corner of the workshop, to a locked cabinet he seldom opened. Inside lay the stranger pieces of his father's legacy, mechanisms and devices that served no obvious purpose, contraptions that seemed to defy the very laws of mechanics as they were understood. Most mysterious of all was the rusted, gear-laden device Archibald had discovered hidden in a lead-lined box beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth and accompanied by a note in his father's handwriting bearing only 3 words, "Never fully assemble." Perhaps it was the melancholy brought by the anniversary of his father's disappearance, or simply the restlessness of a mind too active for slumber. But tonight, Archibald found himself retrieving the key to that forbidden cabinet from its hiding place inside the hollowed-out spine of Newton's Principia. The tumblers clicked softly as he turned the key, and the cabinet door swung open with a protesting creak. The device lay exactly as he had last seen it, incomplete, mysterious, alluring in its complexity. Unlike his father's other creations, this one bore no signature mark, no initials or date of completion. Instead, its brass and copper surface was etched with symbols that resembled no alphabet Archibald had ever encountered, interspersed with Roman numerals that followed no logical sequence he could discern. The central mechanism, a nested arrangement of gears surrounding what appeared to be a small glass chamber, remained unassembled, just as his father had left it. Archibald lifted it carefully and carried it to his workbench. "What were you building, father?" he whispered, as if the man might somehow answer from whatever realm had claimed him. What purpose could this possibly serve? For hours he examined the device, sketching its components, measuring the tolerance of its gears, attempting to deduce the logic behind its design. The fog outside thickened and the rain intensified, drumming an irregular rhythm against the window that contrasted with the perfect regularity of the grandfather clock's ticking. Occasionally distant thunder rumbled across the countryside. As the night deepened, Archibald's eyelids grew heavy, but his curiosity remained insatiable. He found himself placing gears that seemed to match, testing alignments, making adjustments with tools designed for the delicate work of watchmaking. Each piece that slipped into place seemed to make the device hum with a strange energy he attributed to his exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The grandfather clock struck 3, each sonorous gong reverberating through the workshop. Archibald's attention had narrowed to a laser focus on the final assembly of the mysterious device. Only one piece remained, a gear with teeth unlike any conventional design, appearing almost crystalline in the lamplight. As he held it above the central chamber, preparing to seat it into position, lightning flashed outside, momentarily flooding the workshop with harsh blue-white light. In that instant, Archibald noticed something extraordinary. The symbols etched along the rim of the device seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, like text viewed through moving water. The Roman numerals glowed with a faint luminescence that couldn't possibly be a reflection of his lamp. His heart began to pound in his chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration flooding his veins. The rational part of his mind urged caution, reminded him of his father's explicit warning, but another part, the part that had always driven him to understand, to know, to unravel mysteries, pushed his hand forward. The final gear slipped into place with a sound like a key turning in a lock. For a moment nothing happened. Then the central glass chamber began to fill with what appeared to be liquid moonlight, a silvery, mercury-like substance that rose from nowhere. The gears began to turn of their own accord, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Archibald tried to back away, but found himself unable to move, as if some invisible force held him rooted to the spot. The device's ticking grew louder, synchronized perfectly with the grandfather clock and, most disturbingly, with Archibald's own heartbeat. The 3 rhythms merged into one pulsing sound that seemed to bend the very air of the workshop. The symbols and numerals on the device now glowed bright enough to cast shadows, rotating around the rim like constellations in an accelerated night sky. "No!" Archibald gasped, finally breaking free of his paralysis and reaching for the device, intending to dismantle it before whatever was happening progressed further. But as his fingers touched the now hot metal, a shock ran up his arm, and the workshop around him seemed to fracture like a mirror struck by a stone. Reality itself appeared to be cracking along invisible seams. The last thing Archibald Whitmore saw before consciousness left him was the device floating inches above his workbench, surrounded by a corona of impossible light. The last thing he felt was his body stretching, tearing, reconstituting, as if every atom were being pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. The last thing he heard was the synchronized ticking suddenly stopping, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the universe itself. And then, nothing. Pain came first, sharp, insistent, pulling Archibald from the void. His face pressed against something cold and wet. Mud. His nostrils filled with smells his brain couldn't immediately categorize. Acrid smoke. Something metallic and organic that turned his stomach, and underneath it all the reek of unwashed bodies and excrement. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, but through it he could make out sounds, distant explosions, shouting, the mechanical stutter of, were those guns? Forcing his eyes open, Archibald tried to process what he was seeing. Grey sky. Brown earth churned into a nightmare landscape. Barbed wire stretched across a wasteland of craters and splintered tree trunks. None of it made sense. Had he hit his head? Was he dreaming? He tried to push himself up and realized his clothing felt wrong, heavier, rougher. Looking down at himself, he saw not his familiar waistcoat and trousers, but a mud-caked uniform of unfamiliar design. Parts of it seemed fused with his own clothing, as if 2 sets of garments had melded together during some impossible process. On his chest, partly embedded in the fabric as if it had materialized there, was his father's watch, the one he kept in his waistcoat pocket, not the mysterious device. Before he could further examine his situation, the ground beneath him shook violently. A deafening explosion sent dirt and debris raining down around him. Instinctively, he covered his head with his arms and tried to make himself smaller. "Get down, you bloody fool!" The voice came from somewhere to his left, followed by a rough hand grabbing his collar and yanking him sideways. Archibald tumbled into a deep trench, landing hard against its muddy wall. Looking up, He found himself staring into the dirt-streaked face of a man perhaps 10 years his senior, wearing a uniform similar to the one now mysteriously adorning Archibald's own body. "Are you trying to get your head blown off?" the man demanded, his accent marking him as a Londoner. "Fritz is shelling the whole sector. Everyone back to the dugouts." Archibald opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to assemble the pieces of this impossible puzzle. The landscape, the uniforms, the weapons, they were unlike anything he had ever seen, yet somehow familiar from books, or perhaps his father's more esoteric journals. Where am I?" he finally managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The soldier gave him a look that mingled irritation with concern. "Took some shrapnel to the head, did you? You're on the Western Front, mate. Somme offensive. Now move your ass before we both end up in pieces." Western Front? Somme? The terms meant nothing to Archibald, yet the urgency in the man's voice compelled him to scramble to his feet and follow as another explosion rocked the earth nearby. They moved along the trench, a deep zigzagging channel reinforced with wooden planks and sandbags, passing other men in similar uniforms who crouched against the walls or huddled in small recesses. The scene was something from a fever dream, or one of the more vivid descriptions of hell from Milton's Paradise Lost. Men caked in mud, many sporting bandages stained with blood and worse. The air thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Constant thunder-like booming in the distance, punctuated by sharper cracks and the occasional scream. Archibald was guided, half pushed really, into a wider section of the trench system where wooden supports created something resembling a room dug into the earth. Men sat on ammunition crates or directly on the duckboard floor, some playing cards, others writing letters, many simply staring into space with vacant expressions that suggested their minds had retreated to safer territories than their bodies currently occupied. "Found this one wandering in no man's land," his rescuer announced to the group. "Seems a bit dazed. Anyone know which company he's with?" The men glanced up, eyes passing over Archibald with minimal interest before returning to their previous occupations. Only one, an older man with a sergeant's stripes and a face weathered beyond its years, gave him more than a cursory examination. "Don't recognise him," the sergeant said, "but uniforms are all so caked in mud now, hard to tell which lot he belongs to. Could be one of the replacements that came in last night." He addressed Archibald directly. "What's your name and unit, soldier?" "Archibald Whitmore," he replied automatically, then hesitated. Unit? He had no unit, no military training, no business being in what was clearly some kind of battlefield. Yet here he stood, wearing a uniform surrounded by men who seemed to accept his presence, even if they couldn't place him. I'm not certain," he added, deciding that confusion might be his best defence until he could make sense of his situation. "There was an explosion. I don't remember much before that." The sergeant's expression softened slightly. "Shell shock. Seen it before." He turned to the man who had brought Archibald in. "Put him with Barker's group. They're down 3 men after yesterday's push. He can sort himself out there until the medical officers can have a look at him." Archibald was led deeper into the trench system, his mind racing to process everything. Shell shock. The Western Front. Somme. These terms, combined with the weapons and uniforms he was seeing, began to coalesce into a horrifying possibility. He had read enough history to recognise the hallmarks of warfare, but this was like nothing from his own time. His own time. The thought struck him with the force of the explosion still rocking the earth above. Was it possible? Had that device, his father's mysterious contraption with its rune-like etchings and impossible mechanics, somehow thrown him forward in time? It seemed absurd, the stuff of H.G. Wells's scientific romances, yet no other explanation presented itself. What year is it?" he asked his guide, trying to keep his voice casual despite the existential dread building in his chest. The man gave him a sidelong glance. "Christ, mate, you really did get your bell rung, didn't you? It's 1916. July, if you've lost track of that too. 1916. The number hit Archibald like a physical blow. 43 years. Somehow he had travelled 43 years into the future and landed in the middle of what must be a war of unprecedented scale, judging by what little he could see from the trenches. A war enveloping nations, perhaps even continents. What calamity had befallen the world during those lost decades? Before he could pursue this line of thought further, they reached another dugout where a group of about 8 men were engaged in the mundane tasks of warfare. Cleaning rifles, mending uniforms, eating from tin containers. They looked up with the same disinterested expressions he had encountered in the previous group. "New one for you, Barker," his guide announced to a stocky, red-faced man who appeared to be in charge. "Found him wandering above. Bit scrambled in the head, but the sergeant says he's yours now." Barker looked Archibald up and down with a critical eye. "Can you shoot?" he asked bluntly. Archibald had fired his father's old hunting rifle exactly twice in his life, both times at targets and with minimal success. "Not well," he admitted. "Can you run messages without getting lost?" I believe I could manage that. Can you follow orders without getting yourself or the rest of us killed?" Archibald swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," Barker snorted. "I'm not an officer, thank Christ. Corporal will do." He pointed to an empty space along the wall. "That's your spot. Jenkins, Hawkins and Murray won't be needing theirs anymore, so take what you need from their kits. Food comes twice a day if we're lucky. Water when you can get it. Keep your head down, do as you're told, and you might live long enough to remember your own name." He turned back to the others, dismissing Archibald from his attention. "Stand to in 30 minutes, lads. Check your ammunition." Left to his own devices, Archibald made his way to the indicated spot where 3 packs lay untouched, their owners presumably among the countless dead this war was creating. The thought of looting from the deceased turned his stomach, but survival instinct overwhelmed moral qualms. He needed to understand this new reality, and more importantly, find a way back to his own time. As he sat examining the contents of the packs, finding items both familiar and foreign, from tobacco pouches to gas masks whose purpose he could only guess at, his hand strayed to the watch embedded in his uniform. It still ticked, but something about its rhythm seemed off, as if it were keeping time to a different clock altogether. Opening it, he noticed the second hand moving in tiny stutters, rather than the smooth sweep it should have exhibited. More concerning were the face and hands, which occasionally seemed to blur and duplicate themselves, showing 2 slightly different times simultaneously, before resolving back into a single image. It was as if the watch itself was caught between moments, unsure of its place in the time stream. First time at the front? The question startled Archibald from his examination. Looking up, he saw a thin-faced man with kindly eyes watching him from a few feet away. "Is it that obvious?" Archibald replied, attempting to strike a balance between the truth and what would be believable to these men. The soldier chuckled softly. "You've got that look, like you've woken up in someone else's nightmare." He extended a hand. "Private Thomas Cooper, formerly a carpenter from Bristol, currently expendable infantry in His Majesty's forces." Archibald accepted the handshake. "Archibald Whitmore. Unusual name, that. Not many Archibalds in the ranks. Where are you from?" "Millfield," Archibald answered automatically. "Small village in Hertfordshire." Cooper nodded. "Never heard of it, but England's full of places I've never heard of. I joined up with 5 other lads from my street. I'm the only one still breathing." He said this matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than the obliteration of his friends. Archibald struggled to find an appropriate response, but was saved by a commotion at the entrance to the dugout. A man in a more elaborate uniform, an officer, Archibald presumed, ducked inside, accompanied by another soldier carrying a large metal container. "Mail and rations," the officer announced. "Cooper, Barker, Simmons, Whitmore and Wells. You're on patrol tonight. Western section of the line needs reconnoitring after today's barrage. Report to Lieutenant Hadley at dusk." Archibald felt his heart sink. Patrol? In this hellscape of artillery and barbed wire? He had no training, no knowledge of military protocols, barely even understood the conflict he'd been dropped into. Yet refusing would surely raise suspicions he couldn't afford if he hoped to find a way home. As the officer departed and the men fell upon the rations with desperate enthusiasm, Cooper nudged Archibald. "Stick close to me tonight," he said quietly. "First patrol's always the worst. I'll show you the ropes." Gratitude flooded through Archibald. "Thank you. I'm afraid I'm rather out of my depth here." Cooper's smile held no humour. "We all are, mate. Not a man in these trenches was born for this madness. We're butchers and bakers and candlestick makers playing at being soldiers, because some men in fine offices decided our lives were worth less than their pride." He handed Archibald a tin of something that might generously be called stew. "Eat. You'll need your strength." As Archibald forced down the unidentifiable contents of the tin, he observed his new companions more carefully. They moved differently than the men he had known, more cautious, more contained, as if conserving energy for the next crisis. Their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, never fully relaxing even in this relative safety. These were men who had seen horrors Archibald could scarcely imagine, who had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. What must it be like, he wondered, to live with the constant expectation of violence and death, to know that at any moment steel and fire might rain from the sky and end your existence? It seemed a form of torture more cruel than anything devised in the darkest dungeons of history. As the day wore on, Archibald tried to glean as much information as possible without revealing his complete ignorance. He learned they were indeed in France, near a river called the Somme, fighting against Germany and its allies in what the men variously called the Great War, or, with bitter irony, the war to end all wars. The conflict had been raging for nearly 2 years already, with no end in sight and casualties mounting by the thousands each day. The sheer scale of it boggled Archibald's mind. In his time, wars were relatively limited affairs fought by professional armies, not this industrial slaughter engulfing entire nations. What had happened to the world he knew? What series of events had led humanity to this precipice? Moreover, what had his father's device truly done? Had it somehow predicted this future and sent Archibald forward to witness it? Was there a purpose to his displacement, or was he simply the victim of forces beyond his understanding? As these questions swirled in his mind, the distant thunder of artillery continued unabated. Occasionally the earth would shake as a shell landed particularly close to their position, sending cascades of dirt raining down from the dugout ceiling. The men barely reacted to these near misses, so commonplace had they become. As evening approached, the call came for stand to, a ritual, Archibald learned, where every man manned the firing line at dawn and dusk, the most likely times for enemy attack. He followed Cooper up a series of wooden steps to the trench proper, where they took positions along a raised platform that allowed them to peer cautiously over a wall of sandbags. The sight that greeted him was beyond anything his nightmares could have conjured. The land between the opposing trench lines, no man's land, Cooper called it, stretched perhaps 200 yards to another set of earthworks barely visible in the gathering darkness. The intervening space was a lunar landscape of shell craters, tangles of barbed wire, and the unmistakable shapes of human bodies in various states of decomposition. Some had clearly been there for days or weeks, rotting in the summer heat, providing grim landmarks in this geography of death. "Don't look at them too long," Cooper advised quietly, noticing Archibald's horrified gaze fixed on a particularly visible corpse. "It doesn't help them, and it doesn't help you." Archibald tore his eyes away with effort. How do you bear it?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. Cooper was silent for a long moment. "You don't," he finally replied. "Not really. You just pretend to. You build walls in your mind, put all this," he gestured at the devastation before them, "on the other side. And you pray those walls hold until you can go home." He paused, then added, "If home still exists when this is over." They stood their watch in silence after that, each lost in his own thoughts. When the order came to stand down, they returned to the dugout to prepare for the night patrol. Archibald was issued a rifle, a Lee Enfield, Cooper informed him, which felt impossibly heavy and awkward in his hands. A steel helmet, a canteen of water, emergency rations and various other items were added to his gear until he felt like a pack horse rather than a soldier. As they waited for the appointed hour, Archibald found himself studying his pocket watch again. The anomalies he'd noticed earlier seemed to be intensifying. Now the face occasionally displayed impossible configurations, hours that didn't exist, minute hands moving backward, second hands that split and followed different paths simultaneously. More disturbing still, when these glitches occurred, Archibald experienced brief but intense disorientation, as if his consciousness itself were stuttering like the watch's mechanism. During one such episode, the dugout around him seemed to freeze entirely. Men caught in mid-motion, smoke from cigarettes hanging motionless in the air, even dust motes suspended as if embedded in glass. For what felt like several seconds but could have been less, Archibald alone moved in a world turned to a tableau. Then reality snapped back with a sensation like a rubber band breaking, leaving him gasping and dizzy. None of the others appeared to have noticed anything amiss, continuing their preparations without pause. "Are you all right?" Cooper asked, concern evident in his voice. "You've gone white as a sheet." "Just nerves," Archibald managed. unwilling to voice what he had experienced. Either he was losing his mind, a distinct possibility given the circumstances, or something far stranger was occurring. Either way, now was not the time to explore it further. At precisely 2200 hours, their patrol assembled near a communication trench that would lead them to their designated sector. Lieutenant Hadley, a gaunt man with tired eyes who couldn't have been much older than 25, briefed them quickly and efficiently. "We need to assess damage to the wire in sectors 4 through 6, and determine if Fritz has moved his forward positions during the confusion of today's barrage," he explained, pointing to locations on a mud-smeared map. "No heroics, no unnecessary engagements. We observe, we report back. Questions." There were none. The 5 men checked their weapons one final time, blackened any exposed skin with burnt cork to reduce visibility, and followed Hadley into the darkness. Moving through the trenches at night was a disorienting experience. The zigzagging passages seemed designed to confuse, and the occasional flare fired from either side cast strange, shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Archibald focused on Cooper's back, trusting the more experienced soldier to guide him safely. They reached a point where the trench system ended at a ladder leading up to ground level. Hadley went first, peering cautiously over the edge before signalling the all clear. One by one they followed, crouching low as they emerged into no man's land. The reality of this blasted territory was even more horrifying up close. Shell craters, some filled with stagnant water, pockmarked the earth like smallpox scars. The twisted metal of barbed wire entanglements reflected what little moonlight penetrated the clouds. And everywhere, the detritus of battle, broken rifles, shredded equipment, and worst of all, the omnipresent dead, their forms often reduced to unrecognisable heaps of cloth and flesh. They moved in a loose formation, communicating through hand signals Archibald barely understood, but desperately tried to mimic. The night was surprisingly loud. Distant machine guns stuttered, artillery boomed on the horizon, and occasionally the haunting cry of a wounded man calling for help drifted across the battlefield. As they approached the first section of wire they were to inspect, Archibald's watch began to behave erratically again. The ticking increased in volume until it seemed impossibly loud in his ears, drowning out even the sounds of war around them. The hands spun wildly, and the face glowed with the same unearthly light he had seen emanating from his father's device just before his displacement. Then, without warning, the world around him changed. The night remained, but the battlefield transformed. Where moments before there had been cratered earth and tangled wire, now Archibald saw grassy fields under moonlight, unmarred by war's devastation. In the distance, instead of trench lines, peaceful farmhouses stood with soft light glowing from their windows. He blinked, and the vision vanished, reality snapping back to its war-torn state. But something had changed. His patrol companions were frozen in mid-stride, as motionless as figures in a photograph. Even the flares that had been drifting slowly earthward hung suspended in the air, their light creating statuary from the surrounding landscape. Archibald's heart pounded in his chest as he realised he was experiencing another temporal anomaly, but this one far more pronounced than before. Was this what his father's device was designed to create? Fissures in the fabric of time itself? Before he could further contemplate the implications, reality fractured again. Now he saw multiple overlapping scenes like double-exposed photographs. The battlefield as it currently existed, yes, but also glimpses of what it had been before, peaceful farmland, and more disturbingly what it might become, a memorial site with stone markers and trim grass, visitors walking solemnly among monuments to the fallen. The watch in his hand burned hot suddenly, forcing him to release it. Rather than falling, it remained suspended in the air before him, ticking so rapidly the sound became a continuous hum. Around him, time itself seemed to stutter and skip like a damaged gramophone reel. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the phenomenon ceased. The watch dropped into the mud, reality solidified, and his companions resumed their movement as if nothing had occurred. To them, perhaps nothing had. The entire episode might have transpired in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Archibald retrieved his watch with trembling fingers, noticing that while it now ticked normally, the hands pointed to an impossible hour, 13 o'clock, before suddenly resetting to the correct time. Whatever was happening to him, it was escalating, and somehow connected to both the watch and the device that had sent him here. "Keep up," Cooper hissed, dropping back to nudge Archibald forward. "Wool gathering will get you killed out here." Forcing his mind back to the immediate danger, Archibald followed the patrol as they completed their assessment of the wire emplacements. They were perhaps halfway through their assignment when Hadley raised a fist, the signal to freeze. Everyone dropped to the ground, pressing themselves into the mud. In the silence that followed, Archibald heard what had alerted the lieutenant, voices speaking in a language he didn't recognise but assumed must be German. Their enemy patrol was nearby, perhaps on a mission similar to their own. For long minutes they remained motionless, barely breathing. The German voices grew closer, then began to fade as the patrol apparently moved in a different direction. Hadley was just beginning to signal they should continue when a flare burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. "Down!" someone whispered urgently, but it was too late. They had been spotted. The night erupted with the chatter of machine gun fire. Dirt kicked up in a line marching toward their position as the German gunner adjusted his aim. Hadley shouted something Archibald couldn't make out over the din, but the intent was clear: run or die. The patrol scattered, each man making for the nearest shell hole or depression that might offer cover. Archibald found himself sprinting alongside Cooper, zigzagging to present a more difficult target as bullets whined past them. They dove into a water-filled crater just as another flare burst above, followed by intensified gunfire. "Stay down," Cooper panted, loading a fresh magazine into his rifle. "They'll have to expose themselves to get a clear shot. When they do..." He left the implication hanging. Archibald nodded mutely, clutching his own rifle, but knowing he lacked the skill to use it effectively. The cold, fetid water of the crater soaked through his uniform, but fear kept him from noticing the discomfort. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed. One of their patrol caught in the open, perhaps. As Cooper cautiously raised his head to assess their situation, Archibald's watch began its now familiar malfunction. The ticking accelerated, the face glowed, and the hands spun wildly. He tried to warn Cooper, to explain what was happening, but found himself unable to speak as the air around them seemingly thickened into something with the consistency of syrup. Time slowed, stretched, then stopped altogether. Cooper remained frozen in mid-motion, his features locked in an expression of grim determination. The water in the crater ceased to ripple. Even the tracer rounds from the machine gun hung suspended in the air like deadly fireflies. In this moment outside of time, Archibald became aware of something extraordinary. He could move, not just himself, but objects around him. He reached out and touched one of the suspended bullets, finding it solid and hot to the touch. With careful pressure, he was able to nudge it slightly off its trajectory. An idea formed in his mind, a desperate, possibly insane idea. If he could alter the path of one bullet during this temporal anomaly, what else might he change? Could he affect the outcome of the firefight? Perhaps save lives that would otherwise be lost? With trembling hands, he reached for other suspended projectiles, diverting them away from where he and Cooper crouched. It was painstaking work, requiring both physical and mental effort that left him gasping. Each bullet he touched seemed to resist his interference, as if reality itself objected to his meddling. As he worked, he became aware of a strange phenomenon. After-images, or ghosts of events that had not yet occurred. He could see hazy outlines of Cooper raising his rifle and firing, of German soldiers advancing across no man's land, of blood blooming from wounds not yet inflicted. It was as if the immediate future existed as a probability field that he could perceive while in this suspended state. More disturbing still, he noticed thin, fracture-like lines in the air itself, visible only when he moved his head in certain ways, catching the light of the frozen flares. They resembled cracks in glass, spreading outward from his position like a spider's web. Were these physical manifestations of the damage he was doing to the time stream by his very presence, let alone his interference? Before he could consider the implications further, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, radiating outward from where the watch pressed against his skin. The timepiece had grown searingly hot, burning through fabric to leave its imprint on his flesh. The pain broke his concentration, and reality shuddered around him. Time resumed its normal flow with a sensation like a physical blow. The redirected bullets flew off in their new trajectories, missing their targets. Cooper fired his rifle without seeming to notice anything amiss. The German machine gun fell silent, its operators perhaps confused by their sudden inability to hit what should have been easy targets. "Now!" Cooper shouted, grabbing Archibald's arm. "Back to our lines while they're regrouping." They scrambled from the crater and ran in a crouch toward where they believed their trenches lay. In the darkness and confusion, Archibald quickly became disoriented, but trusted Cooper's instincts. Behind them, German voices shouted in alarm, followed by renewed gunfire that seemed to lack the precision of earlier volleys. They reached a stretch of barbed wire that marked the approach to the British lines. Cooper called out a password that Archibald couldn't quite catch, and answering voices guided them to a gap in the defences. Hands reached out to pull them into the relative safety of the forward trench. "Where are the others?" an officer demanded as they collapsed against the mud wall, gasping for breath. Cooper shook his head grimly. "Scattered when the machine gun opened up. Simmons took a hit, I think. Didn't see the lieutenant or the rest after that." The officer cursed under his breath. "Stay here until the all clear. We'll send out a recovery party at dawn if they haven't made it back by then." As the adrenaline of their escape began to fade, Archibald became aware of how thoroughly exhausted he was. Every muscle ached, and his lungs burned from exertion, and the acrid smoke that hung perpetually in the air. More concerning, though, was the throbbing pain where the watch had burned him, a perfect circular imprint now branded into his chest. Cooper noticed his discomfort. "You hit?" "No," Archibald replied, not sure how to explain what had actually happened. "Just winded." Cooper nodded, accepting the explanation without further question. First time under fire is always the worst. Gets easier. He paused, then amended, "Not better. Just easier." They made their way back to their dugout, where the remaining members of Barker's group greeted their return with minimal acknowledgement, relief tempered by the knowledge that survival today meant nothing for tomorrow. Archibald collapsed onto his designated space, too exhausted even to remove his mud-caked boots. Sleep, when it came, brought no respite. His dreams were a kaleidoscope of temporal fragments, visions of his workshop in 1873, glimpses of the battlefield in various states of destruction and reconstruction, and most disturbingly, flashes of what seemed to be other wars, other conflicts stretching both backward and forward in time. In each, the same pattern repeated, men killing and dying for causes that would be forgotten before the blood dried on the ground. He awoke with a start to the sound of the morning artillery barrage, the daily hate, as Cooper called it when he handed Archibald a tin cup of something approximating tea. Weak sunlight filtered through the entrance to the dugout, suggesting it was perhaps 7 or 8 in the morning. "Barker wants you on messenger duty today," Cooper informed him. "Probably figures you're not ready for the firing line after last night. Report to the command post after stand to." Archibald nodded gratefully, still struggling to fully wake. As he sipped the tepid tea, he surreptitiously examined his watch. It appeared normal now, ticking with reassuring regularity, though the face seemed subtly altered. The numerals more deeply etched, the hands slightly more ornate. He wondered if these changes were physical manifestations of whatever temporal disturbances the device was experiencing, or merely tricks his exhausted mind was playing on him. The burn on his chest throbbed in time with the watch's ticking, creating an unsettling connection between his flesh and the timepiece. When he touched the wound through his shirt, he felt an echo of the strange sensations he had experienced during the temporal anomaly in No Man's Land. A stretching of perception, a blurring of moments into one another. After the morning stand to, Archibald made his way through the trench network to the command post, a slightly more substantial dugout reinforced with corrugated iron and containing actual furniture in the form of a map table and several chairs. There, a harried lieutenant handed him a sealed envelope and terse instructions to deliver it to a Captain Blackwood at a forward observation post half a mile down the line. The journey through the communication trenches was physically demanding, ducking under low-hanging support beams, navigating around work parties, repairing collapsed sections, occasionally pressing himself against the wall to allow stretcher-bearers carrying the wounded to pass. The entire network of trenches formed a grotesque parody of a city's streets, complete with intersections marked by crude signposts bearing names like Piccadilly and Oxford Street. Bleak humour from men desperate to impose some familiarity on this alien landscape. As he travelled, Archibald attempted to organise his thoughts about his situation. The evidence suggested that his father's device had indeed created some kind of temporal displacement, throwing him decades into the future. But why here? Why now? Was it random chance that had deposited him in the middle of this particular hell, or was there purpose behind it? More pressing was the question of how to return to his own time. The device itself remained in 1873, presumably still on his workshop table. All he had was his pocket watch, which seemed somehow linked to the temporal disturbances he was experiencing, but offered no obvious means of controlling them. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, unusual in their rhythm and heaviness. Looking up, he saw a most unexpected sight. A woman making her way confidently through the trench, dressed in the uniform of a nurse. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with intelligent eyes and a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a striking quality of determination. She nodded to Archibald as she passed, then paused, her gaze lingering on him with sudden interest. "You're new," she stated rather than asked, her accent marking her as educated and possibly upper class. "Yes," he replied, uncertain what else to say. "Archibald Whitmore." "Charlotte Winters," she returned, extending a hand which Archibald shook after a moment's hesitation. Physical contact with women outside his immediate family wasn't common in his era, but he remembered enough about social niceties to recognise the gesture. "I'm with the voluntary aid detachment at the clearing station back there. Haven't seen you before." "I just arrived," he said carefully. Something in his tone or expression must have struck her as odd, for she tilted her head slightly, studying him more intently. "You're different from the others," she observed. "Your speech, your manner. Where are you from exactly?" Before Archibald could formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely mad, his watch began its now familiar malfunction. The ticking grew louder, the face glowed, and the hands spun erratically. Simultaneously, the world around them slowed, colours bleeding out until everything took on a sepia tone like an old photograph. This time, however, the temporal anomaly didn't affect Charlotte. She remained animated, her eyes widening as she observed the phenomenon. "What on earth?" she breathed, looking around at the frozen soldiers in the trench, then back at Archibald. "What's happening?" "What is that device?" Archibald stared at her in astonishment. "You can see this? You're not affected like the others?" She shook her head slowly, wonder and confusion warring in her expression. "Everything stopped except us. And your watch, it's glowing." Before Archibald could respond, reality fractured again. This time, instead of freezing, the environment around them began to shift, images overlapping and merging like a photographic plate exposed multiple times. They saw the trench as it was, but also as it had been days or weeks earlier when freshly dug, and simultaneously as it would be years later, overgrown with grass and wildflowers, a scar slowly healing in the landscape. Charlotte grabbed Archibald's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "Make it stop," she urged, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." "I don't know how," he admitted, equally frightened. "It happens on its own. I think—" He broke off as a new vision intruded, the trench dissolving around them, replaced momentarily by a modern roadway with strange horseless carriages moving at impossible speeds, metal beasts that roared and belched smoke. Then that too vanished, replaced by the original trench, now frozen in time once more. The watch grew hot in Archibald's hand, not burning this time but pulsing with energy. Acting on instinct, he pressed it against the wound on his chest where its twin was branded into his flesh. There was a sensation like an electrical current passing through him, and the temporal distortion suddenly collapsed. The world snapped back to normal, soldiers continuing their tasks as if nothing had happened, unaware of the ripple in reality that had just washed over them. Charlotte stood very still, her face pale. "What are you?" she whispered. "I'm human, just like you," Archibald assured her quickly. "But I'm not from here. Not from now." She stared at him for a long moment, then, remarkably, a spark of curiosity replaced the fear in her eyes. "Come with me," she said decisively, taking his arm. "We need to talk, and not here." She led him through a series of turns in the trench, until they reached a small alcove that had been dug into the wall and curtained off with a piece of canvas. Inside was a crude desk fashioned from ammunition crates, stacked with medical supplies and paperwork. "My office, such as it is," Charlotte explained, gesturing for him to sit on one of the 2 wooden stools. "I sometimes use it when checking supplies or completing reports." She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "Now tell me exactly who you are and what just happened out there." Archibald hesitated. The rational part of his mind warned against revealing his impossible situation. She would think him mad, perhaps report him to the authorities as a spy or deserter suffering from delusions. Yet something in her direct gaze suggested a mind open to extraordinary possibilities, and he desperately needed an ally who understood this era far better than he did. Decision made, he began his tale, starting with his life in 1873, his father's mysterious disappearance, and the discovery of the device that had hurled him through time. He explained the temporal anomalies he'd been experiencing, the strange behaviour of his watch, and his desperate need to find a way home. Throughout his narrative, Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression shifting from scepticism to fascination. When he finally fell silent, she sat back, processing everything he had told her. "Under normal circumstances," she said after a long pause, "I would assume you were suffering from shell shock or some other psychological trauma, but I saw what happened in that trench. Time stopped for everyone but us." She leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And there's something about you, your speech patterns, your confusion about things any soldier would know, little anachronisms in how you carry yourself. You're out of place here." "You believe me then?" Archibald asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm not certain what I believe," she admitted, "but I know what I saw. And if there's even a chance you're telling the truth." She trailed off, then smiled slightly. "Well, I've always had a weakness for impossible problems. Before the war, I was studying natural sciences at Bedford College. My professors thought I was wasting my education, that a woman should be content with a general understanding rather than pursuing serious scientific inquiry. I'd like to think they were wrong," hope sparked in Archibald's chest. "Then you'll help me?" "I'll try," she promised, "though I'm not sure how much help I can be with matters involving time travel. It's hardly covered in nursing textbooks." Her attempt at humour faded quickly. "But first I need to see that wound you mentioned. Where the watch burned you." Reluctantly, Archibald opened his shirt enough to reveal the circular burn on his chest. Charlotte's clinical detachment faltered momentarily at the sight. A perfect imprint of the watch face, the numerals and hands clearly visible on his reddened flesh like some bizarre tattoo. "Extraordinary," she murmured, leaning closer to examine it. "The skin isn't blistered as I would expect from a conventional burn. It's more like a brand, but impossibly detailed." She touched the edge of the mark gently, and Archibald gasped as another flicker of temporal distortion rippled through the dugout. Brief but unmistakable, the colours bleeding away for a split second before normalcy reasserted itself. Charlotte withdrew her hand quickly. "There's a connection," she said, her scientific mind clearly racing ahead, "between you, the watch, and these temporal events. Your physical body seems to be acting as some kind of conduit or anchor point." Before they could discuss further implications, a shell landed nearby, close enough to shake dirt from the dugout ceiling. The normal sounds of the front, which had faded into the background of their conversation, reasserted themselves with jarring clarity. "I have to go," Charlotte said, gathering her medical bag. "There will be casualties from that barrage, and I'm needed at the clearing station, but I want to continue this conversation." She scribbled something on a scrap of paper. "I'm off duty tomorrow evening. Meet me here, at this map reference. It's an abandoned farmhouse just behind our lines. The medical officers use it sometimes, but it should be empty then." Archibald took the paper, suddenly reluctant to see her leave. Charlotte represented his first real hope of understanding what was happening to him, and possibly finding a way home. "I'll be there," he promised. "And thank you for believing me, or at least not thinking me completely mad." She paused at the entrance to the dugout. "Oh, I haven't ruled out madness entirely, yours or mine. But madness would be a far less interesting explanation than time travel, don't you think?" With that parting comment and a brief smile, she was gone, leaving Archibald alone with his thoughts and the ever-present background symphony of war. Remembering his original assignment, he hastened to deliver the message to Captain Blackwood, finding the officer in a forward observation post peering through a periscope at the German lines. The captain barely acknowledged him, simply pocketing the envelope with a grunt of dismissal. Messenger duty, Archibald was learning, involved a great deal of hurrying, followed by being treated as if one were invisible. As he made his way back through the trench system, the day's activities swirled around him. Men cleaning weapons, repairing damaged sections of the trench wall, writing letters home, or simply staring into space with thousand-yard gazes that spoke of horrors witnessed and absorbed. It struck Archibald that despite being displaced in time, he was effectively trapped here, subject to the same dangers as these men whose war this actually was. That evening, as he sat with Cooper and the others in their dugout, attempting to choke down another meal of unidentifiable meat and hardtack, news filtered down from command. There would be a major push in 3 days' time, a renewed offensive to break the stalemate. The men received this information with grim resignation rather than enthusiasm or fear. Yet another march into the meat grinder, with success measured in yards gained and lives expended. "Will it make any difference?" Archibald asked Cooper quietly. "This offensive, will it change anything?" Cooper considered the question with more seriousness than Archibald had expected. "Probably not in the grand scheme," he admitted. "We take their trench, they counterattack and take it back. A few hundred dead on both sides, and the lines end up more or less where they started." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "But someday one side or the other will break. Has to happen eventually. Every empire falls in the end." Archibald was struck by the philosophical depth behind Cooper's seemingly simple statement. This ordinary carpenter from Bristol had been forced by circumstances to contemplate matters of history and human nature that most people never considered. War, for all its horror, seemed to strip away pretension and force a stark confrontation with reality. "And what will you do?" Archibald asked. "After the war, I mean. If you—" He stopped, unwilling to voice the obvious caveat. "If I survive?" Cooper finished for him with a grim smile. "Go home, rebuild my life, try to forget." He shrugged. "Same as everyone else. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to get through each day. Truth is, I can't really imagine a world without this anymore." He gestured around the dugout. "Can't remember what it feels like to wake up without the sound of guns, to walk without crouching, to breathe air that doesn't taste of cordite and death." The conversation lapsed into silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. As darkness fell outside and the dugout was illuminated only by the dim light of a single lantern, Archibald examined his watch again. It seemed stable for now, ticking with the steadiness that had once made it a reliable companion rather than a mysterious harbinger of temporal chaos. Yet as he studied it, he noticed something he had missed before. Tiny symbols etched around the inner edge of the case, nearly invisible unless one knew to look for them. They resembled the runes on his father's device, though simpler in form. Had they always been there, or were they another manifestation of the watch's transformation? Archibald's contemplation was interrupted by a commotion at the dugout entrance. A runner appeared, breathless with urgency. "Engineers need men," he announced. "Tunnel collapse in Sector 7. Anyone not on watch, follow me." Several of the men groaned but rose to their feet, grabbing helmets and gloves. Cooper motioned for Archibald to join them. "Come on," he said. "Digging's better than sitting here waiting for a shell with your name on it." They followed the runner through the darkened trench system to an area Archibald hadn't seen before, where a large entrance had been cut into the trench wall, reinforced with timber supports. Men were emerging from this opening, covered in dirt and coughing violently. Others were organising rescue equipment, shovels, picks, lanterns and stretchers. Part of the countermining operation collapsed, an engineer sergeant explained as he assigned them positions. "We've got men trapped about 50 yards in. Need to shore up the affected section and get them out before Fritz realises what's happened and sends over some heavy stuff to finish the job." Archibald soon found himself in a line of men passing sandbags and timber supports into the tunnel entrance. The work was back-breaking, made worse by the oppressive heat and lack of air in the confined space. Those entering and exiting the tunnel looked increasingly exhausted, their faces streaked with sweat-tracked mud, eyes red from the dust. After perhaps an hour of this labour, a shout came from inside. "We're through! We need stretcher-bearers!" Cooper immediately volunteered, pulling Archibald with him. "Come on," he urged, "or it's our duty." Reluctantly, Archibald followed him into the tunnel, a cramped, timber-lined passage barely tall enough to stand in, lit at intervals by lanterns that cast more shadows than light. The air was thick with dust and the smell of disturbed earth, making each breath an effort. They hunched forward, moving deeper into the claustrophobic space until they reached a section where the tunnel widened slightly into a crude chamber. There, several men lay on the ground, some moving weakly, others ominously still. Engineers worked frantically to stabilise a section of ceiling that had partially collapsed, while medics attended to the injured. Cooper and Archibald were directed to a man with a clearly broken leg who needed evacuation. As they carefully lifted the injured soldier onto a stretcher, Archibald's watch began its now familiar malfunction. The ticking accelerated, echoing strangely in the confined space as if coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The face glowed, casting eerie shadows on the tunnel walls. "Not now," Archibald muttered, desperately willing the temporal disturbance to subside. The last thing he needed was to create some catastrophic anomaly deep underground, where any disruption could bring tons of earth down upon them all. But the phenomenon intensified, the air thickened, time slowed, and once again Archibald found himself in that strange between state, where he alone remained fully animated while others moved with glacial slowness. The light from the lantern stretched into long, fluid streamers that danced across the walls like living things. Then, with horrifying clarity, Archibald saw something no one else could. Fracture lines spreading through the timber supports above them, wooden beams beginning to splinter under the weight they held back. In the normal flow of time, these breaks were still forming, invisible to the naked eye. But in this dilated moment, Archibald could see the disaster unfolding before it happened. The supports would fail completely within minutes, burying everyone in the chamber. As he watched, frozen in horror, the temporal distortion shifted again. Now he saw not just the impending collapse, but multiple potential outcomes branching from this moment like paths in a garden, each determined by the actions taken or not taken in the next crucial minutes. In most of these potential futures, the tunnel collapsed with devastating loss of life, but in a few, specific interventions resulted in everyone escaping before catastrophe struck. The revelation hit Archibald with the force of epiphany. Perhaps this was why he had been sent here, to this specific place and time, not randomly, but with purpose. His father's device hadn't malfunctioned, it had worked exactly as designed, placing him at a temporal nexus point where his knowledge of future events could alter history's course. But should he interfere? The question plagued him even as time began to resume its normal flow. If he changed events here, what ripples might spread outward, affecting the timeline in ways he couldn't possibly predict? Yet if he did nothing, men would die who might otherwise live. The moral calculus seemed impossible, but the decision, he realized, had already been made for him. He couldn't stand by and watch men die when he had the power to save them. Whatever consequences might flow from his interference, they couldn't be worse than the burden of inaction. As reality solidified around him, Archibald raised his voice urgently. "Everyone out! Now! The supports are failing!" The engineers looked at him skeptically until one of them noticed a fresh crack appearing in a timber directly above them, accompanied by an ominous creaking sound. "He's right," the man shouted. "Evacuate! Move the wounded first!" A flurry of activity ensued as stretchers were hastily loaded and men began filing toward the exit. Archibald helped Cooper with their assigned casualty, moving as quickly as the confined space allowed. Behind them, the groaning of the overburdened supports grew louder, small showers of dirt beginning to rain down from the ceiling. They had nearly reached the tunnel entrance when a massive crash echoed from the chamber they had just left, followed by a concussive wave of dust and displaced air that knocked several men off their feet. The collapse had begun. "Run!" someone shouted unnecessarily, as everyone was already moving at their maximum speed through the restrictive tunnel. Archibald and Cooper staggered the last 20 yards to the entrance, emerging into the relative openness of the trench just as a rumbling series of secondary collapses shook the ground beneath their feet. As they set down their stretcher and looked back, dirt continued to fountain from the tunnel entrance, gradually diminishing as the collapse stabilized. Men were counting heads, checking who had made it out and who might still be trapped inside. "How did you know?" Cooper asked Archibald, his voice hushed with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "About the supports failing? You called it before anyone else saw the signs." Archibald opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to explain. Before he could formulate a response, the engineer sergeant approached, his face grey with dust but his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Good eye, lad," the sergeant said. "Don't know how you spotted that fracture from where you were standing, but you saved lives today. If we'd stayed in that chamber another minute—" He left the thought unfinished, clapping Archibald on the shoulder before moving off to organise the wounded men's evacuation to the field hospital. Cooper continued to study Archibald with newfound interest. "There's something different about you," he said finally. "Can't put my finger on it, but it's there." He smiled slightly. "Whatever it is, I'm glad you were with us tonight." As they made their way back to their dugout, Archibald felt the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders. He had changed events, potentially altered history's course. The men who had survived the tunnel collapse because of his warning would go on to affect other events, creating a cascade of changes that could theoretically spread outward indefinitely through time. Yet the timeline hadn't immediately unravelled, suggesting that perhaps history had more resilience than he feared, or perhaps the changes he had made were so minor in the grand scheme that they created only ripples, not waves, in the river of time. More important was the implication that his displacement might have purpose, that he had been sent to this particular moment for a reason. If that were true, what other interventions might he be meant to make, and who or what had orchestrated this journey? His father? Some higher power? Or merely the impersonal mechanism of the universe self-correcting some temporal anomaly? As these questions churned in his mind, Archibald became aware of a new development. The burn mark on his chest, the imprint of the watch face, had begun to change. The numerals and hands that had been branded into his flesh were shifting positions, just as they did on the actual timepiece during moments of temporal distortion. When he touched the mark, images flashed through his mind. Fragmented visions of places he had never seen, events that had not yet occurred. Most vivid among these was a recurring image of a particular section of the battlefield, a seemingly unremarkable stretch of no man's land distinguishable only by a blasted tree stump and an unusual configuration of shell craters. In this vision, the earth itself seemed to shimmer and distort, as if reality were thinner there than elsewhere. With sudden certainty, Archibald knew this was what he needed to find. A weak point in the fabric of time, perhaps the very spot where his arrival had punched through the normal constraints of chronology. If there were any hope of returning to his own era, it would begin there. The next evening, after completing his messenger duties for the day, Archibald made his way to the abandoned farmhouse where Charlotte had arranged to meet him. The structure stood perhaps half a mile behind the front lines, damaged by shell fire but still largely intact, its stone walls having withstood what its wooden roof had not. Inside, the remaining furniture had been repurposed or scavenged, leaving only a few chairs and tables scattered among the debris. Charlotte was already waiting, having exchanged her nurse's uniform for a simple dress and coat that made her look startlingly civilian amidst the militarized zone. She had spread several maps and papers on a table and lit a small oil lamp that cast long shadows across the room's irregular surfaces. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said, without preamble as Archibald entered, "and I have a theory. It's rather fantastical, but no more so than time travel itself." "I'm listening," Archibald replied, taking a seat across from her. "What if the device your father created wasn't meant to send people through time randomly, but to specific moments when intervention was needed?" She leaned forward earnestly. "There are certain points in history that serve as nexus events, moments when small actions can have disproportionate effects on future outcomes. What if your father found a way to identify these moments and built a machine that could place someone there to ensure the right choice was made?" The theory aligned with Archibald's own recent thoughts regarding the tunnel collapse, but raised further questions. But why me? And why this particular war? What could be so important here that it would justify tearing someone from their own time? Charlotte's expression grew sombre. "This isn't just any war, Archibald. The scale of this conflict is unprecedented in human history. Millions are already dead, and millions more will die before it's over. And I fear it won't truly end even when the fighting stops. The hatred and resentment being sown now will bear bitter fruit for generations." She pushed one of her papers toward him, a series of calculations and diagrams he didn't fully understand. "I've been studying reports from all along the front, looking for patterns in what you described, moments when time seems to behave abnormally. There are accounts, mostly dismissed as hallucinations or battle fatigue, of soldiers experiencing strange phenomena, moments that repeat, premonitions of events seconds before they occur, glimpses of landscapes as they existed before the war." "Temporal fractures," Archibald murmured, remembering the crack-like patterns he had seen in the air during his own experiences. "Exactly, and they seem to cluster in specific areas." She pointed to several locations marked on her map, particularly here, near what the soldiers call the Blasted Heath, a section of no man's land that's been contested so many times The earth itself seems changed by it. Archibald felt a shiver of recognition. A stretch with a distinctive tree stump and an unusual pattern of shell craters. Charlotte looked up sharply. Yes. How did you know? He explained about the visions he'd been experiencing, the changing mark on his chest, and his growing certainty that this location held the key to understanding his displacement. As he spoke, Charlotte's expression shifted from scientific curiosity to something approaching awe. It's all connected, she breathed. You, the watch, these fractures in time, they're part of something larger. The question is, what are you meant to do now that you're here? Before Archibald could respond, the distant rumble of artillery grew suddenly louder, and the farmhouse shuddered as shells began landing closer than before. A new barrage, heavier than the usual evening. Hate. Charlotte quickly gathered her papers. We should get to shelter. The Germans must have spotted movement in this sector and adjusted their fire. They hurried to the farmhouse cellar, a stone-walled chamber that offered better protection than the partially destroyed upper floors. As they descended the stairs, the building took a direct hit, the impact sending them tumbling the remaining distance to the cellar floor. Dust and debris rained down, as part of the ceiling collapsed, but the sturdy stone walls held. Archibald picked himself up, coughing in the dust-filled air. "Are you hurt?" he called to Charlotte, who was pushing herself to a sitting position nearby. "Just bruised, I think," she replied, brushing debris from her clothing. "But we may be trapped down here until someone digs us out." As if to confirm her assessment, there was another crash from above as more of the structure gave way, sending a cascade of timber and stone tumbling down the cellar stairs, their only exit. A few final pieces clattered down, and then silence fell, broken only by the muffled continuing barrage outside and the settling of debris around them. Archibald examined their prison by the light of Charlotte's lamp, which had miraculously survived the fall. The cellar was about 15 feet square, now partially filled with rubble from above. The walls appeared intact, but the staircase was completely blocked by debris that would take hours to clear, even with proper tools. "Someone will come looking eventually," Charlotte said, attempting to sound optimistic. "The medical officers know I sometimes use this place. When I don't return to the clearing station..." She trailed off, both of them aware of the reality. In the chaos of war, with casualties constantly demanding attention, it might be days before anyone noticed her absence, let alone organised a search party to this particular location. Archibald was about to offer some words of encouragement when his watch began its familiar malfunction. The ticking accelerated, the face glowed, and time around them began to distort. But this anomaly was different from previous occurrences, more intense, more focused. The air itself seemed to warp and bend, colours inverting momentarily before settling into a state where everything appeared slightly out of alignment, as if viewed through imperfectly ground lenses. "It's happening again," Charlotte whispered, moving closer to Archibald. "But something's different this time." She was right. Rather than freezing or slowing, time seemed to be folding around them, creating what Archibald could only describe as pockets of temporal distortion throughout the cellar. In one corner, rubble that had fallen during the collapse now rose back to the ceiling, then fell again in an endless loop. In another, dust motes hung completely motionless in the air, while everything else continued to move normally. Most dramatically, a section of the cellar wall directly opposite them began to shimmer and fade, revealing glimpses of other times and places. The farmhouse as it had been before the war, green fields stretching to distant trees, the same location decades in the future, overgrown but peaceful, and most disturbingly a vision of trenches more ancient than their own, filled with soldiers in Roman armour, suggesting this land had known war long before the current conflict. "It's as if the barriers between time streams are breaking down," Archibald said, watching in fascination and horror as reality fluctuated around them. "My presence here, my interference with events, I think I'm causing damage to the fabric of time itself." Charlotte's scientific mind was clearly racing to process what she was witnessing. Or perhaps these barriers were already weakened, and that's why your father's device sent you here specifically, to repair the damage, not cause it. As if responding to their discussion, the watch grew hot in Archibald's hand, while the matching brand on his chest burned with renewed intensity. Acting on instinct, he pressed the watch against the mark, gasping as energy surged through him like an electrical current. The cellar around them destabilized further, reality seeming to hold its form only directly around their bodies, while dissolving into temporal chaos elsewhere. Through this maelstrom a pattern emerged. The various visions and distortions began to organise themselves into what appeared to be a pathway, leading to the shimmering section of wall that now resembled a doorway more than a solid barrier. "I think," Archibald said slowly, "we're being shown a way out. Not just from this cellar, but perhaps a way for me to return home." Charlotte gripped his arm tightly. "If you step through that portal, or whatever it is, you might end up anywhere, any time. It could be a one-way journey with no guarantee of reaching your own era." "I know," he acknowledged, "but I'm beginning to understand why I was sent here. Not just to save those men in the tunnel, but to witness this war, to understand what humanity is capable of both in cruelty and courage. Perhaps my father hoped that knowledge from the future might somehow help change the past.